Hello? Okay. Have you ever tried to change something about yourself to fit in? A laugh and a chuckle mean yes. Anyone else? Yeah. When I was in 7th grade, everyone started wearing Champion brand socks. It changed everything. And I had to have them. And I got them. And nobody noticed. And it changed nothing. I was so quickly disappointed with these magical socks that they didn't magically change my popularity status. Today we're looking through a small window into the life of a man named Zacchaeus. Cool name. A man who likely, since he could remember, wanted to change his status. In today's text, the passages read, they said 4 things about him right away. It said he was the chief tax collector. It said he's wealthy, so he's good at it. He wanted to see who Jesus was, and he's short. If I'm Zacchaeus, I'm like, thanks, Bible. Why do you have to point out that I'm short? It's not typical of Scripture to offer up that kind of information about people. The Bible doesn't waste a whole lot of time talking about the way people looked. A few stories are like that, but not often. Unless it's important to the stories, the writers just aren't going to mention how you look. But it is important to Zacchaeus' story. And he's always been short. There's certainly nothing wrong with being short, but it proved to be problematic in his life. Apparently, his physical stature mattered to others around him, and he let it matter to him. And I can imagine for him that it likely led him to be singled out, left out, called out for something that he had no control over. Whenever this happens, it hurts. Right? Even if we think we're someone with pretty thick skin, or we want to believe that the comments that others make about us, the way we look, we could just let it roll off of our back. The truth is that they still land and they still hurt. And then they can also change the way we think about ourselves. And we're susceptible to believe that this one thing in our life, again, which we cannot control, is at the center of our identity. And then we move into a place where it becomes the only thing we focus on. And it can become something that we spend a lot of mental and emotional energy wishing it was different. Can you relate? Another way we might interact with this story is to try and compensate for it in other areas of our life. That's another path we take. Areas where we do have control in hopes that it deflects enough attention away from the things that we don't want highlighted or noticed and are insecure about. Who's been there? If you went through junior high, you know what I'm talking about. That's what I think happened for Zacchaeus. I think he found himself at the butt of a lot of jokes. I think he found himself left out. Left out at worst, unnoticed at best. Coming of age for him in his context is 12 to 13 years old. I don't think we need reminding, but that's like high stage puberty. That's when he becomes a man in his context. While all the other boys around him are shooting up in stature, he gets left behind. Life isn't fair. And I know I say this as a 6.5-foot tall human being, does not leave me void of other problems. I don't think I was fully coordinated until the age of 22. But that energy has to go somewhere, doesn't it? Richard Rohr reminds us this. I love this quote. It says, "Pain transformed is no longer pain transmitted." Zacchaeus lived into untransformed pain. And it worked for a while. It made him wealthy. It made him known in his community. Notorious, but known. It gave him status and power, and I'm pretty sure that throughout his adult life, he thought to himself things like this. Well, this will show people to mess with me. I'm the chief tax collector. What I say goes. If anyone dares to mention how short I am, well, they can literally pay for it. Because that's how things went for chief tax collectors. If they wanted to make more money for themselves, all they had to do was instruct local tax officials to extort the community for more money. No one was going to argue it. They held immense power. And even if people knew it was bogus, paying an extra surcharge here and a hidden fee there, they would do it so that they'd be left alone. So for tax collectors, chief ones at that, it's organized crime under the flag of local government. That's where Zacchaeus would find his worth and his wealth. But it cost his community dearly. It also cost him his community and his relationship to it. This is where overcompensation got Zacchaeus. And sure, he was rich and powerful within his community, but I don't think it made him happy. He still wanted things to look different, but now he's stuck. But then one day, he heard that a prominent miracle-working rabbi was coming through town, and he was curious. Because here's a guy with power, right? He speaks to demons and casts them out of people. He heals illnesses and ailments, and the blind receive sight, and the dead are resurrected. There's water to wine, and he walks on water. I'd want to see that guy. For someone fixated on gaining status and power, certainly he's naturally curious about someone who wields a certain power. So the buzz about Jesus' arrival in Jericho that day reverberates through this city, and he had to see this man for himself. And when he goes out to the streets to watch Jesus walk into town, and the crowds are too large, and being an exceptionally short person, as we're made aware of, he's also resourceful. And he finds a nearby tree, and he climbs it to get a better look. And as Jesus and the crowd come closer and closer to the tree, Zacchaeus gets his first glimpse of the miracle worker. And the miracle worker gets a glimpse of him. Zacchaeus! How does he know my name? Before Zacchaeus can respond to Jesus, Jesus tells him to climb down from the tree and then invites himself over to Zacchaeus' house for lunch, which nobody saw coming. Now, how Jesus knew his name, good question, Adam, we don't know. I can imagine a scenario where someone, at some point, pointing in Zacchaeus' general direction up in the tree, gives Jesus a quick rundown. He's like, who's that guy in the tree? He's like, well, if you really want to know, no one likes him. I think something like this happened because of the fact that Jesus reaches out to him. I mean, certainly he was known. And regardless of his level of notoriety, Zacchaeus matters to Jesus. Where there is hurt and poor self-image, Jesus is there. Amen. And Jesus seeks to restore this man. Now at verse 7, the writer points out that at this invitation, the crowd begins to mutter. And someone says out loud enough for someone to hear it, that he's gone to be the guest of a sinner. And then between verse and 7, it'd be good to take a pause. Between 7 and 8, Jesus and Zacchaeus share a meal together. We cannot miss this fact and hurry too quickly to verse 8, because this meal together is not just a meal. It's a conversation and a transformation. And we don't exactly know how the conversation goes, but something transformative happens in that conversation, at that table. In their conversation, stories are shared and truth spills out. Zacchaeus feels safe and comfortable enough with Jesus to share his heart. Maybe he shares how he's always felt growing up and how he ended up in this position. If we read 7 to 8, it's like this immediate transformation that happens miraculously, but there's got to be more meat to it. Because something changes in Zacchaeus in this relationship with Jesus. I'm sure for him it was cathartic. A major relief to let all of that go and tell someone the truth. And to not receive more shame about it. Because I think Jesus offers him a way forward. Again, we know this is to be true because of what happens next, what Zacchaeus declares, but exactly how they got there, we don't know. But I think we can gather that between Jesus and Zacchaeus and their conversation, it's centered around this question. What do you want to do now? What do you want to do now? What do you do with a confession like that? I think after Zacchaeus' confession, Jesus helped him to move into accountability, responsibility, agency, and action. While Jesus is helping Zacchaeus do some personal soul work, he's also helping him find restoration in his community. When Zacchaeus returns to the bustling town square, he is not the same person he once was. And the text in English says, he stood up and said to the Lord. But in the Greek it says, he made a stand. I don't want to mince words here, but I think it's worth pointing out that he stands before Jesus with this renewed sense of confidence to face his shortcomings and his community, with a renewed sense of identity and purpose. And for someone who needed a lot of transformation, he stands confidently in it. The next thing that happens is that Zacchaeus makes two major declarations. The first thing he says is, I give half of my possessions to the poor. Why? Because he has been transformed. Earlier that day, he was someone who was holding on to his possessions and status very tightly. These things helped define who he was. But now that he's arrived at this place where he can let half of those things go, like that. And not only is he able to give half of his stuff away, he uses what he has to benefit others. In particular, those who are poor and without. He's always known about the poor. But now that he's been transformed, he's in a place where he wants to be a blessing to his community. The second thing Zacchaeus says is, if I've cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay them 4 times back the amount. And that is a serious commitment. It communicates a few things in particular. First, he admits that he's cheated people. He puts it out there. And he puts himself at the mercy of his community. There's no way he could remember all the people he's cheated. There's no way. There's no way he could remember how much he's cheated people out of. There's no way. But by saying this, he has now opened the door and welcomed anyone who can remember being cheated, which they'll remember. He has opened the door and welcomed anyone who can remember being cheated by him to confront him. And he'll pay them back 4 times whatever he stole. It's a merciful position. That's a vulnerable one. To welcome your victims, give them an opportunity to claim restitution. How many criminals do that? Yeah. And second, he just essentially committed the rest of his life to paying people back. Third, what is laid out in Leviticus 6 and Numbers 5, this is the law of the Lord. It says, if anyone steals, they are responsible to pay back what was stolen plus 1/5 of the original amount. Not a crazy amount, but enough to be like, yeah, I definitely stole, and this is my admission of that. And then in 2 Samuel 12:6, to be exact, King David, there's this situation that happens, and it makes him angry, where this rich man stole a lamb from a poor man, because he didn't want to use his own lamb. He stole it from a poor man and required to use for a sacrifice. And David required the rich man to pay the poor man back. How many times do you think? 4 times. It says you took 1, you have to give 4 back. That's insane. You have everything you need, and you stole from the poor one? Well, you owe him 4 times as much. That was not the law of the Lord, but that is what King David decreed when he saw such a grave injustice. And that's the place Zacchaeus puts himself in. The rich man who stole from the poor. And what's Jesus' response to this? Salvation has come to this house. You get it. Salvation has come to this house. Deliverance has come to this house. This man who was once bound to his power and ego and money and status and lack of principles is now free from all that. That's salvation. Freedom from our old ways. Freedom from the vices that bind us. Freedom from self-preservation, and freedom into a generous, open, and gracious way of living. Was this salvation for Zacchaeus alone? No. When we are saved from what we used to do, when we are delivered from who we used to be, it is also for the benefit of our community. We are not islands unto ourselves. We are part of something bigger. Jesus doesn't just want to save Zacchaeus from himself. He doesn't just want to save you from yourself. He wants to restore you to right relationship, to your true self, to God, and to your community. I'm quite sure that the majority of the people in Zacchaeus' community wanted a different kind of justice. I'm sure some would have loved to see Zacchaeus thrown in jail, excommunicated, at the very least, publicly shamed by Jesus. But that's not the kind of justice Jesus brings. That is criminal justice. There's a place for that. And what Jesus brings is restorative justice. I'm going to put a few slides up. And here's the difference. And I don't know if you can see this, so I'll read it out quick. This is comparing the two different views. On the left, we have criminal justice, and on the right, restorative justice. In criminal justice, crime is a violation of the law and of the state. Violations create guilt. And justice requires the state to determine blame or guilt and impose the pain or punishment. The central focus here is that the offenders are getting what they deserve. Again, what likely the majority of the crowd that day would have loved to see. But Jesus brings the restorative justice. That we're seeing crime is a violation of people and relationships. And that these violations create obligations. Where justice involves victims and offenders and community members in an effort to put things right. And the central focus here is that the victim's needs and the offender responsibility. The offender takes responsibility for repairing the harm. This is from the law school at University of Wisconsin-Madison, in case you're wondering. Let's go to the next slide. And this is really helpful. 3 different questions for each view. In criminal justice, it asks, what laws have been broken, who did it, and what do they deserve? And in restorative justice, it seeks who has been hurt, what are their needs, whose obligations are these. In the third slide, we have a Venn diagram. On the top circle is victim, the pink circle is offender, and the purple circle is community. It just got blacked out. But it shows this relationship between victim and the offender, that there is accountability. It ensures that from what happened to the victims and for the rest of the community who is feeling unsafe about what happened can have some community safety, can be ensured that this sort of behavior won't carry on. And that the offender and the community work together for competency development. In other words, how do we ensure this doesn't keep happening? How do we hold accountability for each other? Not denying what happened and not trying to cover it up and not trying to find a simple solution, but how do we honestly work together for the sake of our community? Because Jesus is interested in the restoration of all things and making all things new. Jesus is interested in justice and righteousness and tov. Justice, which is concrete actions taken to correct injustice. Righteousness as the standard of what is right and equitable relationship. And tov, the Hebrew word, which means good, but with this fuller intent, which implies that something that fulfills the purpose of which it was created. Church, that is what Jesus calls us into in our salvation. So often we hear about our personal salvation, which isn't wrong or problematic. But sometimes this idea of personal salvation can become warped into an individuality of our faith, devoid of any sense of right and equitable relationship with others. Devoid of accountability and responsibility to the brokenness that plagues our communities, and devoid of any true compassion that leads to mercy and restorative justice. And this shows up in how we can easily look down at others, whether they're Christian or not, and despise the way people choose to live their lives. Jesus is calling us to a radical love that doesn't ignore wrongdoing, but seeks to bring grace and wholeness. Sometimes this shows up in our lack of concern for others, those who can't seem to pull it together, whatever that looks like. Jesus is calling us to a radical love that doesn't ignore, but seeks to bring grace and understanding and restoration. Salvation is never just about us. It's about the whole thing. It's about the restoration and the renewal of all things. And Jesus is asking us to be courageous enough to lean into it, to see what and who he is calling us to for the sake of love and grace and righteousness and justice and tov. Some of you know that I'm from Minneapolis, which is a couple years ago where George Floyd was killed. and it set our city on fire. And people seethed with anger at the injustice. Because it wasn't a one-time event. It exposed an entire system of racism and brutality and power. And it didn't just highlight it for Minneapolis. It highlighted it for our country. And then when I turned on the news and I watched it, and people were protesting in London and across the world in Europe, and I'm like, same problem? Imagine that. Because it hit something deep in us. When we saw the injustice, and for those of you and those of us and I who watched it, you can't unsee it. And my instinct is, let's lock Derek Chauvin up. That is not how a police officer should react. That's not appropriate. But as a follower of Jesus, I had to come to grips with that. Because Jesus calls me in my salvation for the salvation of the community, for justice and righteousness for those in my community who don't experience justice and righteousness. And to be so bold and so courageous as to pray for Officer Chauvin, who is a child of God, who is mixed up, who let power and poor ego go to his head and then to his heart. And Jesus, in my anger and in my prayer, calls me to pray for him, to pray for the offender. Will restorative justice come? I don't know. Has it changed? Has this incident changed how things are going in Minneapolis? Absolutely. Is there still a long way to go? For sure. But as easily as I can see myself in this story as Zacchaeus and in my own brokenness, I also see myself in the crowd. And if I've walked into the town, if I walked into Jericho with that day, would I walk out praying for and rejoicing in Zacchaeus' restoration? I hope so. Jesus is calling us to the renewal of all things. Let's pray. God, this is a packed story. And depending on where we are at today, we see ourselves in a number of different places in this story. God, for those of us who see ourselves in Zacchaeus' shoes, where we have lived a life of, or at least some days recently of lying or taking advantage of and ignoring and causing pain and hurt. God, although we're thankful for the guilt that comes, I pray that we don't stay there, but that we find ourselves at the table with you, where we are invited to eat and to drink and find new life. God, I pray too that we find ourselves courageous enough to admit out loud where we fall short, and to pray into the places and the people that you are calling us to bring wholeness and restoration and renewal. God, give us the courage, because that will require a lot of vulnerability on our part. Maybe there's some things, God, that we need to say sorry for. And God, if we find ourselves in the crowd today, incensed at the idea that you would love the one who has hurt us, that you would go and spend time with and have a meal with the one who has caused pain and destruction. Oh God, will you soften our heart and remind us that salvation needs to come to the whole house, to the whole thing. In Zacchaeus, in the community, and in us. God, thank you for this gracious story. Thank you for the result. Thank you for the way that you show up and remind us of what you can change and what you can do to bring life. Amen.